Yeah, really excited to show you the My Assignments web part today. Specifically looking at some of the education graph API endpoints. And if you've not used an education tenant before, this might be quite new to you. So hopefully something interesting for everybody. So a bit about myself. I'm founder of Cloud Design Box. I've worked with the SharePoint framework for a long time, since preview. But I'm not a developer by trade. I started off with using JavaScript and script editor web parts. One thing led to another, and I was making web parts. So I've got some contact details there. So blog, email, and the GitHub repository that we'll be looking at today. So it's there for you to have a look at, download, edit, make changes to, make your own version of. That's all available. And some of the endpoints we'll be looking at in today's demo. So some of these you might be familiar with from just your standard graph endpoints. Some of these are education specific. So starting with the education me endpoint, this is very similar to the me endpoint in graph, except it's got some extended AAD properties that are specific to education. So you'll get extra stuff like the student's grade, or if they're a teacher or a student, what their status is. That will all come back with that education me endpoint. There's also the me joinedTeams, which is just listing your teams as you would get it with your standard graph calls. And then two more education specific ones. So the education me classes is the same as the groups endpoint, but it's filtered to the type of group, which is a template of a class. So inside education, we have the concept of a class team, and you get thousands of these made every academic year in a typical high school. And in a tenant, you might have hundreds of thousands of these. So this endpoint filters it down so you can just retrieve the class groups that you're a member of. And the me assignments endpoint, this is specific to education. So there is no alternative in sort of the standard graph endpoints. So in the education version of Teams, there is a assignments part Teams where you can set assignments to students. It's got some really amazing features in there. So you can do things like use AI to measure students' reading progress, and you can set assignments and collect it back. So again, if you've not seen it before, check it out. It's only available to education tenants, unfortunately. So you can't sign up to a developer tenant easily. You need to get in touch with the right people at Microsoft. And all the data inside these teams and inside these endpoints is populated by something called Microsoft School Data Sync. And any school can use that for free. Teams and Office 365 is free for schools. And they can upload their data using CSVs, or they can use OneRoster APIs. There's lots of different ways of getting your data into graph, into those AAD objects. And there's a reference to those at the bottom. And this is a quick screenshot of what the assignments look like inside Teams, just so you can visualize what it is that we're trying to aggregate together inside SharePoint. So the Teams assignments is fantastic. Lots of really cool features in there, like a massive amount of features in there. It'll take you all day to look at all of them. In fact, sometimes there's too many. But one thing you can't do is you can't show an aggregated list of those in your SharePoint intranet. So this is one of the things that we wanted to do with this web part. And there was quite a few challenges that we came across. So there was no me assignment endpoint until recently, not officially supported. So you had to go a really long way around getting those assignments. You had to get a list of all the classes, query each class for a list of assignments, put them all together. So it was incredibly intensive when you're calling those API calls for the first time. And throttling is quite bad in education because everybody logs in at the same time at the start of the school day or the lesson, potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands of people logging in, loading the same page when they open up their web browser. So it's really important to keep the API usage to a minimum, to use caching, so we're not calling it too many times. So without that me endpoint, we couldn't do it very well. We had to use some server-side caching to do that previously. So that's really good that that is now supported and we can use it in this example. There is an academic rollover process in education as well. Again, something that happens around this time of year. That's why we're all stressed at the moment. And we have to archive all the old class teams. So again, hundreds of thousands of them, do a cleanup process, and then upload the new data for the new academic year. So there's a big process there in September of creating hundreds of thousands of teams inside education tenants, potentially with loads of assignments as well, because if you imagine if you're in 20 different classes in your high school, over the year you're going to have lots of assignments set, so they add up really quickly. So I'll start off just by jumping into a demonstration, and then we'll have a look at the code. So I'm on a SharePoint page here, and if I go to add a web part, so this is running from my local host, and I type in assignment, you'll see Microsoft last week released an assignment web part, but it doesn't show you aggregated assignments. It only shows you the assignment if you put it on a class team page, which is a new homepage that they're designing in Teams, another new feature to education. So if I add this to the page, it doesn't do anything. So this web part's still useful. So if we go and add the My Assignments web part that we've created, this is what it looks like. It shows me all the assignments that have been set inside Teams, and I can just check that. So I can go into Teams, go to my aggregated assignments view inside Teams. You can see I've got some here that I've set. This one is in the past, so we've filtered that in the web parts. And I can see the assignments that are due. I can, if I just publish the page, we've got some paging on here because the list can get very big if teachers don't remember to close off assignments at the end of the day. And if I click on an assignment, it will take me straight to that Teams assignment. So if I just use the web app, it'll take me straight into that Teams assignment. So I can go to it really quickly and easily, straight from SharePoint, straight from my school intranet homepage. And I've got a refresh button here because we cache it for a couple of hours just to avoid lots of throttling. So you can press the refresh button, it will go and fetch the data again. So back into the code. So I'll start off with the API permissions that we're using in here. So some of the endpoints share some of the API permissions. So we only require 3. This is a minimal amount of permissions you need to make this web part work. So we've got the assignments read, which lets us read any assignments and for us as a user. We've got the user read all, which fetches us back the user type and the user attributes, which will tell us if this person is a member of staff or if they're a student, because we need to show a slightly different view of assignments if they're a member of staff than if they're a student, because assignments might be overdue if you're a student, but for the teacher, it's not overdue. It's either set or it's closed. And there's also the edu roster. So this gets us a list of classes and the list of teams, and this actually gives us that join teams permission as well. So we don't need to add that as an extra API permission. So those are the permissions I've used. In this example, I've used React. So I started using React a couple of years ago, found it really useful in reducing development time once I got my head around it. So starting off just in the main file, we've got the web part properties. So there are some settings that we allow end users to do. So we've got a slider to assign the paging value, how many assignments we want to show in one view. We've got the ability to hide overdue assignments because they can get quite big if teachers don't close them off. And we can also show archive teams, so from previous academic years. And the settings for that, if I just edit the web part, you'll see these are the settings that we have here. I've only got a few assignments here, so if I change it, I can change it to 5, so you can't see the paging in action, but that will create another page, and I'll be able to flick through the pages of assignments when they get quite big. So going into our main React component, so we've got a main React component where I do pretty much everything, and then we've got the child component for the assignment item, which refreshes whenever the state changes in the parent item. So what we've got is some states that we use in this particular web part. So a lot of this data is coming back from Graph Async, so it's going to come back to us at different times. So we refresh the web part as that data comes in, as we know more about it. So we've got assignments in there, teams, courses, and one really useful tip if you are using the Graph API is to download the graph types, because that will let you define some of those interfaces much easier. So I can bring in, let me show you a quick example, the education class, and it already maps all those properties that's going to come back from that API endpoint. So I'm not having to manually do that and create, complex interfaces. So that's definitely a really useful thing that we used when calling Graph. And just to go through the different Graph calls that we use in here. So the first graph call we do is to get the education me endpoint. And the only reason we do that is to find out if they're a member of staff or if they're a student. So we only select the primary role. And when that comes back to us, it will tell us if they're a user, if they're a student, or if they're a teacher. We set that in the state. Again, that refreshes the content, and it will style the content for a student. So the reason we do that is some assignments might be overdue for a student, so we mark them as red and overdue. And for teachers, we show it slightly differently. So an assignment is either set in the future or it's set in the past. And what you'll see is I've created a caching service. I use this with most of the web parts that I create, which is a way I can just cache any of the Graph API calls in local storage. I set some keys for them. So I've got little helper functions to do that. And then inside here, what you see is when the data comes back, we set that in the caching key as well, just before we refresh the state. So if we ever refresh the page, it doesn't have to load that again. It's already got it. So minimal API calls where possible. One really disappointing thing we have to do is call the joinedTeams endpoint. And the only reason we have to do that is to find out if the team is archived, because the education endpoint for classes doesn't show that AAD property. If it did, we wouldn't need to do this call at all. So unfortunately, it adds on an extra call when we're creating the web parts, which obviously isn't great, but it's only one call. So it's not the end of the world. We'll just call it and find out if the class is archived or not. We go and get the classes. So we get the course name and the display name of that particular class. And then we go and get the assignments for me. So we could just return the assignments for me, but you wouldn't know which class those assignments belong to, which course they belong to, which isn't great for the student experience. So that's why we call the assignments API. There is a lot of limitations to using this at the moment, so we can't do a lot of filtering on this. We can't filter by date. Again, quite disappointing. So we're having to manually do that in some of the functions inside the code, which is a real shame, really. But again, it just adds a bit more complexity to that web part. So we're sort of sorting stuff by time. We also add in the paging as well. So again, I've just set the paging as part of the state. And then what we do when we actually go to render the web part, so if I just go down into the render code here, you'll see that we render the HTML that we've aggregated up from that child component, but we also render the pages, so the paging and where we are in that page. So whenever that state gets updated, somebody clicks on the button and it calls back that function and refreshes the state with a new page number. That will then filter down into this render function, and it will refresh the child components. Now, if I show you what the assignment item looks like, so this is the assignment item. It's quite a simple React component. We've got a URL to open up that direct link to the assignment. It's a very long URL where we have to add in the class ID, which we got from another reason why we have to get the class ID is we need it to link to the assignment. And we go and get the assignment ID as well. So once we've got that, we can generate that link to go straight into that assignment item inside Teams. So that's what we do in terms of the child item. And in terms of, just a very quick look at the other things I was going to show you. So in terms of the caching, one thing that we do is we refresh the cache if maybe it's a bit out of date and the student needs to press the refresh button. So we have a function where we do that. So if I just have a quick look at where the cache is refreshed here. So we do a check for the cache before we call the APIs. And that means we don't even need to bother calling the APIs if it exists in the cache, because this function runs, it checks the cache on the local machine, and then it will refresh the state with that cache data. So once it's got that, we know then that we don't need to call the APIs. So what you see in the render function here, we check the cache first. Once we've checked the cache, if it's empty, then we'll then call the assignments API. We'll call the Teams API and the course API and the end user API to get that data into that web part. So another thing I was also going to show you as well is what happens when we refresh the data. So if somebody presses the refresh button, we run this function, and this clears all the cache. So it removes the cache from the user's machine. And then we just set the state as blank. And then when the web part refreshes, it knows it needs to call the API again and get that data back. What you also might be aware of is we create quite a complex caching string. So again, where this might differ to using cache in other places is in schools, you might have a shared device where a student logs in and then another student logs in to the same device. And if we don't include the login name, then the cache will include assignment data from the previous user. And if we don't include the location, we might have a multi-tenant setup where we've got multiple schools on a single tenant. So we have to remember where that web part is on the page so that we mark that when we're caching the data in the CDB assignments area. And then it's pretty straightforward in terms of styling for the web part. Quite minimal CSS in there. And yeah, that's a pretty much a very quick overview of the assignment web parts. And this is free to download from GitHub. So yeah, feel free to check it out. Have a look at the code. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about it as well. And hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into what's happening in the education tenants, which, like I say, is slightly different to what you might get in your standard developer tenants. You get features like the assignments, you get class teams, so you get a whole host of features that you might not be aware exist inside Teams until you start working with an education-specific tenant. So back to you, Vesa.
Excellent, thank you, Tony. Really cool stuff, and it's I would say it's not just about the education tenant and the education APIs. It was also about how you implemented the refreshing and implemented the web part. That's always an interesting scenario to go through and learn from that, because there's always new people in this call who haven't necessarily even written their first web part yet. So it's thank you for explaining things.
I would recommend using the Microsoft documentation. That's where I learned all this from, was the graph examples on the Microsoft site. Really simple, really easy to do, and you can just apply it to anything, whether it's the education endpoints, whether it's Teams endpoint. It just works really well.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. Really, really cool stuff.